Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. The US appears to be stepping back from its traditional role in global economic leadership. Can Europe fill that vacuum? Can it become even more of an economic force? That is what Creon Butler, our Director of the Global Economy and Finance Programme here at Chatham House, has been arguing this week. Trump is making Europe great again. That's the hopeful joke of those who see opportunity for Europe in the shock from Washington. But that is battling quite a lot of gloom. Mario Draghi, the former president of the European Central Bank, last year laid out a coruscating analysis of the European Union's economic failings. And Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, who commissioned his report, said starkly earlier this year that the European Union had been benefiting from cheap labour from China, cheap gas from Russia, cheap defence from the US, now is going to have to do without them. Could it thrive and become a greater force all the same? So today we're going to look at whether Europe's politics will allow it to make those decisions as one, whether it can crack its economic problems, and where the UK fits into all this. To discuss this and put Creon's arguments to a thorough test, I'm joined by Creon, Olivia O'Sullivan, who runs our UK programme, and Dr. Nicolai von Ondarza, an Associate Fellow in our Europe programme. Let us plunge straight in. Creon, why do you think this is Europe's moment?
Thanks, Bronwen. I think I would frame it slightly differently in the sense that my argument is that US is withdrawing from its traditional leadership role in the global economy, and there's a strong need for someone to step in to preserve as much of that international economic system as is possible. And then my argument would be, frankly, the EU, or Europe more broadly defined, if you take the EU and UK together, is the only economic entity that can do that, and that they should do that. Now, in addition, there are opportunities from this, but I see it more as a kind of necessity that someone needs to step forward and go beyond, if you like, what many countries are doing, which is looking at their own sort of individual responses to President Trump, to some extent being drawn down the American way, the new American way of doing things. Whereas I think there also needs to be this, how are we going to preserve a global architecture in the future?
I'm going to come on right to that point, but I want to ask you first, what do we mean by a global economic architecture? It sounds wonderful. It's very abstract.
It's essentially a system of rules, principles, frameworks that includes trade rules, the IMF's role in managing global imbalances, all the data and analysis that is done by the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. There's rules on dealing with anti-money laundering, for example, for the Financial Action Task Force. There's a very complex and intricate system of international rules and institutions which we have built up over the period since the Second World War and which underpin the growth and prosperity we've seen over the past 80 years.
And you've made a pitch there at the end for countries, the European countries in particular, to act together for this global interest. But the response to that might be, look, we're in tough, realistic times when countries are putting national interest above everything else.
So my argument is that it's actually only the US that is pulling out of this architecture in the fundamental way that it is. Other countries have frustrations with it, but they don't wish to abandon it. But the problem is that although many other countries would say, actually, we'd like to hang on to this, you actually need someone or some entity to come forward and stand up for it. And the argument I'm making is that actually it's only the EU, plus I would argue the UK or Europe, that can do that. Now, I could go into the reasons for that, but maybe come back to that later.
We're going to come on to the purely economic questions in a moment, but just in this first bit of the discussion, I want to talk about whether Europe can make decisions together, whether it can actually give the kind of leadership you're discussing. Nicolai, can I bring you in on this? Do you think Europe still works as Europe?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Europe is always inherently complex. We already touched about the UK-EU divisions. There's, of course, a difference between Eurozone, non-Eurozone member states, and all the different fragmentations that Europe has. I hate to be the pessimist in this round, but I think for Europe to really work up to the challenge, there's much more political will necessary that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. I mean, we've had this flurry of extraordinary summits and meetings in Paris and London and Brussels. And I think what they showed is that there is a willingness from European to step up, but not yet the means, neither on the military side nor the economic side. And the third point of caution is the decision-making in the EU itself. It always has to strive for anonymity, at least in these important decisions, and there needs to work with Trump allies like Viktor Orban, who has often played the veto card. And so at least for now, I would share or put in a little bit more pessimism that the EU can really step up, even if we just think about the EU and not even have touched the tricky questions of EU-UK relations that would come to it.
And you touched on there the differences within Europe over the response to Ukraine, which has been triggering a lot of those recent discussions. Let's just dig a little bit into the economic ones. I'm thinking of the votes, but this is before Trump arrived back on the stage, but the votes within Europe about how to deal with China. And you had Germany voting with, amazingly, Hungary, you just referred to Viktor Orban, and Malta, saying let's keep barriers to trade with China very low. And you had France on the other side saying, no, make them sky high. So you've got big divisions there just on the economic front within Europe, don't you?
Yes, there are big divisions and also there are different pain points. So, for instance, on the car tariffs that were just announced by the US, they will, of course, hit a country like Germany much, much more than other countries. There have been discussions on, or the EU Commission proposed whether the EU should hit back with its own tariffs. And then Trump said he will make additional tariffs on wine, which will hit countries like France or Italy more. And there are these sort of easy points for divide and rules that in particular the Americans can play. Now, the advantage of the EU is that at least in trade policy, unlike in military or security affairs, the EU Commission can at least speak with one voice for the whole of the EU, and not every decision needs to be anonymous. But these pain points are there, and we already saw the Commission walking back from some of the counter tariffs it had put on the table, precisely because it looked back to its own member states and saw it didn't have the backing. So here, Europe has the facilities to act united, but certainly at the moment not the political will, because these pain points are so different.
And the pain points are national interest. I'm going to take that as a point against Creon's argument. I'm going to give him a chance to retort in a moment. But Olivia, you've been looking at this pretty closely in the context of defence and the UK's own part in this, sitting on the sidelines of the European Union, but taking a role in Europe. What do you make of Europe's ability to act as one?
Well, if we're taking Europe to include the UK in this regard, people often say that moments of crisis are when Europe tends to act better together, integrate more, respond more. But of course, that requires that everybody does interpret this moment as one of crisis. And I think sometimes when you talk to people in kind of official Britain, there's a little bit more sanguinity about Trump and about the Trump administration's actions. There's a tendency to emphasize continuity and underplay change. And I think that comes from all kinds of things, including from the sense that it's sort of in the DNA of the British state to cleave quite closely to America, militarily and in trade terms as well. So it really requires quite a lot of creative and new thinking to consider a less American world and to consider whether the UK might work with Europeans to build that, to reform that architecture that Creon is talking about. So I think we might, in order for everybody to act together, everybody has to agree on the nature of the problem. And I'm not sure we're quite there yet. I also think many of the EU responses are in the direction of greater integration. If we're worried about this America's effect on trade architecture, on European security, the kind of obvious responses or proposals from Europe are to become more financially integrated, to invest together more, to build a shared defence industrial base, to spend together on defence. And that's the kind of thing that makes sections of the UK political spectrum nervous. It puts more of a kind of regulatory and spending gulf between the EU and the UK.
So it might be good for Europe, but bad for the UK's hopes of being close to Europe without being part of it.
Exactly. It might be tough for the UK. If the EU becomes more integrated and acts together more on things like defence spending and economic security, the UK is forced to make a choice as to whether it aligns with those European actions or whether it tries to retain choice and control over its scope of movement.
Creon, isn't this a portrait of self-interest, triumphing over the dreams of the European Union or the great contribution to the global architecture as you've wished?
Let me start basically on why I think, if you like, the EU is the only bloc capable of doing this. I mean, it's partly size. So the European Union economy is 18% of global GDP against 26% for the US.
And that's a point really worth emphasising. I'm really glad you brought it up. The EU is a huge trading bloc and bloc of the economic force of the world.
And it's sometimes, and indeed it's sometimes, I think, forgotten by people within the Union that that's the case. I mean, it has the only other currency that's capable of being a global reserve currency in the euro, which is like 20% of foreign exchange reserves against more than 50% for the dollar. But, if you're looking at the alternatives of cryptocurrency or gold, I would far rather go with the euro than I would with cryptocurrency or gold. And then it has...
This is not a podcast where we make lots of financial recommendations, but no, I'm going to let you have that one.
And then it has strong global governance. It's a rules-based system. It has the European Court, rule of law, and it has a suite of alliances with the world. And in those alliances they are different from the US, and they're even more different from the kind of alliances that the US that President Trump seems to be envisaging in future, in the sense that they're based on mutual benefit. But the ability of the EU to lead this effort is that much greater if it can work out a deal on this with the UK, and the UK can do so with the EU. I agree with Olivia. I don't think that the British establishment is there yet, but they may become there as, if you like, the Trump phenomenon rolls on. I mean, we haven't yet got into issues like what he's planning on, what his advisors are suggesting on the role of the dollar, the ability of other countries to own US government securities, financial deregulation, and so you may well find there's a whole suite of common interests between the UK and the EU, all of which centre on let's preserve as much as possible of the existing architecture. And to do that, you need to lead.
And you've made a case in there for cherishing the euro, if you like, and recognising the power that it does have. Let me just ask you, without diving completely into the Ukraine-Russia thing, what if countries go ahead with seizing Russian assets, many of them held in Europe? What will that do to that picture of the wonderful European rules-based order that you just described?
This, for me, is one of the reasons for not doing that. I mean, as I've argued
and
previously.
Now Russia is arguing as well.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. I mean, there's an objective reason why the assets have been frozen, the income is being repurposed, but to go the next step of confiscating those assets would be a blow to the euro's future status. And I think there's a trade-off, and my view is the trade-off should be to think about the need for the euro to be a global reserve currency rather than, if you like, this being the way of financing support for Ukraine, which I also agree with, but not through that.
Nicolai, I want you to take us back to the bigger picture of whether Europe can ever compete again. I used to go to a conference run by the Italian government year in, year out, thank you, the Italian government, and it was about exactly this question of how Europe could compete, particularly with China, and not to parody, but the answer came back year after year, well, we'll make slightly nicer handbags. Obviously, years have moved on, but what is your feeling about the challenge that Mario Draghi set out in this big report on why Europe was struggling to compete?
The last couple of months, I think, is on a European level, there is an agreement on the diagnosis that the EU lacks this competitiveness, that it's losing towards the US and China in issues like artificial intelligence, space, but even car manufacturing. So I think the analysis is shared across Europe. What's not shared is what is the answer to that. And there we have now on the European level, I think, a drive towards a deregulation agenda that is spearheaded by Ursula von der Leyen and the new Commission, which already has shifted to the right. Now we have a German government that also shifts somewhat to the right, and suddenly a caucus of countries in the EU that are really pushing for a different European economic policy. And that comes together with now huge investments on defense and the idea that for defense we also need a single European financial market. And so to maybe sort of for this take the optimistic case, there are the ingredients there on the European level to really change the competitiveness agenda and really bring these 3 points together: the investment, the deregulation, and the sort of focusing on key industrial sectors. So that taken together gives European economic some hope. We already see funds flowing from the US in European markets. But politics need to follow up. So in addition to the Draghi report, we now need implementation on the European level. And I think this is the primary focus now of the EU Commission, to really come from the joint diagnosis to now 3 strands of thinking to actually implementing that on the economic level.
And you're right, Ursula von der Leyen has put a lot of emphasis on this in her second term. You're talking to us from Berlin, and you mentioned the new German government. Well, we hope it's going to be a new German government when it's got its coalition together. What significance does Germany have in getting to some kind of answer?
Germany is the largest economy in Europe, in the Eurozone, and it has lacked in dynamism, at least for the last 5 years. And the historic decision we have had last week, even before the new government has been put into place, was actually the last parliament. This big decision to have, on the one hand, a 500 billion investment fund for infrastructure, and secondly, taking defense and help for Ukraine out of the debt brake. And this will unleash not only a huge new spending drive in Germany, but I think also provide the assets that make the Eurozone more interesting for investors. And so I think there is, at least in Berlin, some hope that this can really drive a new economic impetus for the Eurozone as a whole. And I guess the third point is this deregulation agenda. Germany has been for a long time sort of spearheading the rules above everything approach in the EU, and better have rules than enter into risk. And this new German government certainly is more willing to enter risk. It sees itself to some extent as a government of last chance by the pressure of far-right parties in Germany and across Europe, and makes the argument we need to go much more into risk-taking also on the economic side to convince people both of the sort of competitiveness of Germany but also the EU as such. So I think there certainly is this willingness to take more risk and move more forward, and the ambition for Germany to regain that leadership role that it has lost to some extent in the last 3 years.
Creon, are you convinced by this? Is this going to unlock Europe's potential?
I certainly agree that the priority should be the Savings Investments Unit or Capital Markets Union as being both necessary in terms of supporting that future role of the euro, but also feeding into many of the other things that Europe seeks to do. I would, however, say I think Europe tends to beat itself up to some extent on this. I mean, we've learned actually following President Trump's tariffs on Canada how many internal barriers there are actually within an economy like Canada. So, this is not a unique problem within Europe, although it may be a bigger problem. But I honestly think there is now a motivation for this. We saw after the global financial crisis, the most remarkable things, even if not complete, were achieved in that heat of crisis, and this may build to be even a bigger crisis than it currently is now.
Olivia, let me switch to the UK now, our final subject, if you like. And you were listening to Jonathan Reynolds, our Trade Secretary downstairs at Chatham House. Creon was chairing that discussion, and the UK does beat itself up over these points. Many other people and countries beat it up as well. What did you feel about the strategy that the Secretary of Trade set out?
In terms of...
He was setting out how the UK was going to balance its relations with Europe, with those with the US, and indeed with China. Is that possible?
Yes, I think what we heard from Johnny Reynolds is an echo of the direction we've heard from this government writ large, which is that it's trying to, for as long as it possibly can, avoid making decisions between these 3 poles of the EU, the US and China. And I really like Nicolai's phrase of the government of last chance. I think Keir Starmer and the Labour Party also see themselves as a government of last chance. Although they have this vast parliamentary majority, many of their MPs are defending victories in local constituencies where Reform, the UK's right populist challenger party, is in second place. So although the parliamentary arithmetic would make it seem like they could be quite bold, they're quite a kind of timid government that is concerned that if they don't get this 5 years in power right, they will sort of they'll lose the next election to a challenger party. But their thesis is that in order to avoid that fate, they need to deliver growth. And to some degree, I think growth at all costs. There's quite an overwhelming focus on it in this government, to the extent that some of the concerns that European countries share around relations with China, or the arguments that Creon puts forward about whether a Europe, including the UK, could set out a vision for a different set of rules, a more predictable world order, seem like they're a little bit lower down the priority list than just getting investment, which is what the UK really lacks, at all costs. So the UK, for example, hasn't sought to put tariffs on Chinese goods in the same way that the EU has. It doesn't have the same manufacturing sector to defend. It hasn't sought to pursue the same kind of comprehensive anti-dumping investigations against China. Equally, it hasn't made public statements in the same way against the sort of actions of the Trump administration, is clearly trying to balance relationships between all three of these.
And is that
poles.
possible, coming back to that point? Obviously, Keir Starmer has on several fronts gone out of his way to be very tactful to Donald Trump and to keep up good relations there. But at the same time, he does want some kind of deal with the European Union on defence, but also on making trading life easier after Brexit. And then there's the relationship with China in the background, where the US hasn't given as much attention as I might have expected to it, at least in its public statements, but is concerned about other countries' relations with China. So words are taking him quite away at the time. But is there a trade policy that is coherent?
I think in the end, no, it probably isn't possible. They will be forced to make a decision, not least because I think they probably had a theory of the Trump administration, which a lot of people shared, which is that they'll be chaotic and they'll be difficult to deal with, but they'll ultimately be transactional and to some degree rational actors.
And self-interested, come back to that phrase.
Yes, exactly. And we can make the case that the UK has relatively balanced trade with the US and will avoid the effects of tariffs. I think looking at what's happened so far, that's difficult to evidence. It's been a very volatile 2 months. And I think it might be difficult for the UK to continue to pursue a strategy of trying to carve out from the Trump administration, and that might force a reconsideration of the economic relationship with the EU. It might end up being the better option, but of course it's politically really difficult because this government came in on a manifesto where they said they would not join the single market, customs union, or freedom, or have freedom of movement. So that's tricky in quite a low trust environment with voters.
Creon, did you find Jonathan or Johnny Reynolds convincing on this?
So I agree with Olivia's analysis of where they are, and I think that was supported.
They're trying to have it always at once. We won't call it cakeism, but it's something like that.
I think for the time being, that's their goal, and in a sense I understand why it is their goal, but I agree with Olivia that I'm not sure that, I don't think it's sustainable, and I think the risk is that they realise too late that actually the interest lies in working with the EU to sustain a broad international system, which is fundamentally in our interests, and that actually trying to do deals in the short term with the Trump administration is not going to be sustainable. And in a sense, it goes back to this question of what is the underlying dynamic. I think the underlying dynamic with President Trump is very different from that with President Biden. And we don't know yet, but I suspect that that's the case.
You and your audience went quite a long way to push him to say what a US trade deal might look like or whether one was going to happen, and he was dodging with a smile. But what did you make of what he did say?
So I think what the UK is doing, and again I understand why, is to say, well, OK, President Trump has changed a whole bunch of trade relations, including putting tariffs on much of our important parts of our trade with the US. Let's try and flip that round and out of that create what is a balanced trade agreement with the US. That's what they're trying to do, and if I were in their position I would try the same thing. But sadly I don't think it's going to be successful, and I think the risk is that we will pay too much if we do go down that route in terms of not being able to collaborate and cooperate with the EU in the future.
And get the benefit and the growth that potentially
both benefit and growth, and also the stability that comes from working together to sustain an international architecture. Not the same one as we've had up to now, but one that has rules, has principles and has frameworks.
Nicolai, how do European Union countries see what the UK is doing? We've been describing how it is trying to be friends with all sides.
I mean, there's certainly an interest also from the EU to work closer again with the UK, but also an element of suspicion and caution. I think the suspicion is highest in the trade area. We just heard the interest of the UK to have the special trade agreement, and the UK has so far not made any public announcement of hitting back against Trump tariffs in contrast to the EU. And so there is this suspicion that the UK wants to carve itself out a special competitive place where it trades with the EU but also gets benefit from a special deal with the United States. And so this will be viewed with quite a bit of suspicion from the EU side. I think on the security side, the EU has has made clear that it wants to cooperate with the UK. It has just recently presented these initiatives for joint procurement on the European side, for this loan facility that could be given to EU member states to buy weapons together. And usually in the past, this always was only limited to EU countries and those in the single market like Norway. And now for the first time, the EU says, okay, here we can work together with countries with whom we have a security and defense partnership with, something that is currently under negotiation for the summit in May. And so I think there is some thinking in Brussels whether there can be mechanisms to bring the UK closer also on the security side if it wants to. But again, this ambition is not necessarily shared by all EU member states. For instance, France is at least pushing to tie this negotiation to other Brexit issues like fisheries. And so we see even there the complexity of the European order, and the old Brexit wounds still make cooperation difficult, even where the ambition is there.
Olivia, isn't this the point, that in order to get a relationship with Europe, the UK is under pressure to denounce the Trump tariffs, to respond to them and so on, which it has very pointedly not done? Do you feel we're coming up against a point of decision?
I think there are likely to be some decision points ahead, particularly around this idea of whether the UK and the EU can cooperate on defence and defence spending. Certainly the summit in May, I expect we will see some kind of pact which might open the door for the UK to cooperate on joint procurement or joint funding of a kind of shared approach to defence, although, as Nicolai says, there's all kinds of national interests that might pop up and cause problems in that regard. I think if the UK seeks trade concessions, the EU is likely to push this idea that, well, you know, you can't have kind of concessions from us and closer alignment with us if you're also seeking to play this role, to carve out this kind of niche relationship with the US. And the rubber kind of hits the road on these things when it comes to stuff like regulating technology, where the US is likely to put pressure on the EU, but pressure on the UK as well, to alleviate burdens on big US tech companies, to not cleave closely to the EU's approach to regulating those organisations. Those tech companies are, after all, extremely close to the Trump administration. So you can pursue this approach, I think, of balancing the three for as long as possible, and I understand why they're trying to do it. Those trade-offs will start to bite, and I don't think the Starmer government, there's only a little bit of pathway left, I think, in that regard.
It is a test of patience of allies, clearly. And Creon, would you say that possibly it jeopardises growth, that the UK might not get close to any of them and so therefore not get the growth that it's seeking from any quarter?
I think it's a risk. This is obviously one of the factors. There are many other factors contributing to growth, but it's definitely a risk, yes.
Nicolai, perhaps I can give you the last word. Could you just take a step back? Does this feel like a moment when Europe might change and make an opportunity out of the shock that it has found in its relations with the US? Or is it really just going to expose the differences which we have been describing?
So Emmanuel Macron spoke of this electroshock that's coming out of Washington. So I certainly think that we see the sort of seeds of an awakening of Europe in the defense field, of a more self-confident Europe that says we can take more responsibility for our economy competitiveness and for our security. But the big danger is there that, like the UK, many European countries are afraid to say this out loud. You will have seen very few European leaders speaking about the Trump administration being responsible for breaking the transatlantic bonds. Nobody from the European side wants to hand in the divorce papers to the United States. And I think this is the biggest sort of test for European leaders. They have to prepare, maybe confidentially, the decisions for Europe to take more responsibility, while at the same time, for the longest possible moment, to still say the United States is a reliable ally. Of course, we try to work with Washington. Of course, we try to find a deal with the United States, even if they might think behind closed doors that this is no longer possible in the way that this US administration is now acting on trade, on security, but also on internal politics, where it's mostly working with far-right parties in many European countries.
Well, thank you for giving us the script that I think many European leaders might as well pick up and read out, because it suits their purpose. We're going to have to stop there. You can read Creon's full piece on the Chatham House website, and the title is Europe Must Forge a New Role in the Global Economy. The link's also in the show notes. Our producer this week was Jonathan Coates. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.